First, we're going to be talking about the eye. The eye has many accessory structures, such as the eyebrows, which overlie the supraorbital margins of the skull. Also, another accessory structure is the eyelids, which is protective of the eye and contains tarsal glands. Next is the conjunctiva, which is a transparent mucous membrane. Also, the lacrimal apparatus, which contains the lacrimal gland and secretes and produces tears. Lastly is the extrinsic eye muscles, which causes scanning eye movements and requires 6 muscles, which are the 4 rectus muscles and the 2 oblique muscles. The eye has internal chambers and fluids. The first one is the anterior chamber, which is a humor-filled space inside of the eye between the iris and the cornea. Next is the posterior chamber, which is a narrow space between the peripheral part of the iris. The anterior and posterior poles are located in the back of the eye, usually referring to the retina. The 3 tunics of the wall of the eyeball contain the fibrous tunic, which has the sclera, which is a fibrous protective outer layer of the eye, and it also contains the cornea, which is the outermost lens and functions like a window. It controls and focuses entry of light into the eye. The last tunic in the fibrous tunic is the limbus, which is a border of the sclera and the cornea. Next is the vascular tunic, which holds the choroid. The choroid provides oxygen and nourishment to the outer layer of the retina. It also contains the ciliary body, which has ciliary processes and ciliary muscle. Ciliary processes makes the lens more complex during accommodation, and the ciliary muscle connects the iris to the choroid. The sensory tunic has the pigmented layer, which is outside the neurosensory retina and nourishes retinal walls using cells. The neural layer has several layers of neurons that are connected by synapses and are made out of the rods and the cones of the eye. Lastly is the ora serrata, which is a photosensitive region of the retina. Moving on to the structure of the eye, there's the optic disc, which is a raised disc on the retina and creates a blind spot. There's also an optic nerve, which is the second pair of cranial nerves and transmits impulses to the brain. Next is the Macula Lutea, which is an oval yellowish area near the fovea where the keenest vision is. The fovea centralis is in the retina where visual activity is the highest. And lastly is the retinal detachment, which is where the retina detaches from supportive tissue. If this occurs, there's a loss of peripheral vision. The lens of the eye contains the lens epithelium, which regulates homeostatic functions of the lens. Next is the lens fiber, which changes focal distance of the eye. Crystallins is a transparent structure by which light is focused, and cataracts is a medical condition where vision becomes blurred because the lens becomes opaque. Physiology of Vision is focusing light on the retina and focusing for distant vision. When it comes to focusing for close vision, you need accommodation of the eye, near-point vision, and constriction of the pupils. Some homeostatic imbalances of the eye contain myopia, which is a nearsightedness. This is caused by the eyeball or the cornea being too long and curved. Hyperopia is farsightedness, which is caused by vision that comes to a focus behind the retina. Astigmatism is when an image is blurred due to irregularity in the dome-shaped curvature of the eye.
The first part of chemical senses is taste. Taste buds are sensory organs for taste scattered across the mouth, but most are found in papillae, which are peg-like projections that make the tongue's surface slightly abrasive. The first taste bud is Fungiform Papillae, which is scattered across the entire tongue surface but have only 1 to 5 taste buds each. The next is Circumvallate Papillae, which are the largest and least numerous but have many taste buds. It forms an inverted V at the back of the tongue. The last one is Filiform Papillae, which is all over the tongue and gives your tongue traction and helps move food around. Next are the taste cells. The first one is supporting cells. Gustatory hairs project from the tips of all gustatory epithelial cells and extend through a taste pore to the surface of the epithelium where they are coated in saliva. The next one are the taste cells. There's 3 different kinds. One kind forms traditional synapses with the sensory dendrites and releases neurotransmitter serotonin. The other 2 kinds lack synaptic vesicles, but at least one releases ATP. The last are basal cells. They act as stem cells and replace any taste buds that were burned off by hot foods. Next is basic taste sensations. The first one is sweet. The sweet taste sensation comes from the organic substances like sugars, alcohols, some amino acids, and some blood salts. The next is sour, which is produced by acids. Next is salty, and it's produced by inorganic salts and table salts. The bitter taste sensation comes from nicotine, caffeine, and morphine, and some non-alkaloid substances like aspirin. Umami comes from the amino acids glutamate and aspartate, which are responsible for the beef taste of steak. Next is the physiology of taste. For a chemical to be tasted, it must dissolve into the saliva, diffuse into a taste pore, and contact the gustatory hairs. Activation of receptors is when a food chemical binds to receptors in the gustatory epithelial cell membrane. It induces a graded depolarizing potential that causes neurotransmitter release. Binding of the neurotransmitter to the associated sensory dendrite triggers generator potentials that elicit action potential on these fibers. Transduction to impulse. There are 3 different mechanisms that underlie how we taste. Salty is due to a sodium influx through sodium channels. Bittersweet and umami share a common mechanism, but each occur in a different cell. The gustatory pathway first is a facial nerve, which innervates the anterior 2/3 of the tongue. Then the next one is glossopharyngeal nerve, which innervates the posterior 1/3 of the tongue. And the vagus nerve, which innervates few taste buds in the throat. The second part of chemical senses is smell. The olfactory epithelium is the organ of smell, and it's a yellow patch of pseudostratified epithelium located on the roof of the nasal cavity. The supporting cells cushion the olfactory sensory neurons. They contain a yellow-brown pigment which gives it the yellow hue. The basal cells lie on the base of the epithelium. The olfactory cilia increase the receptive surface area and typically lie flat on the nasal epithelium. The filaments of olfactory nerve are slender, non-myelinated axons of the olfactory sensory neurons that are gathered into small fascicles. The physiology of smell. Activation of receptors are olfactory neurons that are stimulated by binding to receptor proteins. The action potential is conducted to the first relay station in the olfactory bulb. Transduction to impulse. G proteins are activated, which activates enzymes that synthesize salicylic AMP. Salicylic AMP then acts directly on plasma membrane cation channels, causing them to open, allowing sodium and calcium to enter. Sodium influx leads to depolarization and impulse transmission. Calcium influx causes a transduction process to adapt, decreasing its response to a sustained stimulus. Homeostatic imbalances of chemical senses. The first one is anosmia, which is the loss of sense of smell. The effects of zinc can lead to a loss of smell because excessive amounts of zinc is very toxic. Uncinate fits is a form of temporal lobe epilepsy in which hallucinations of taste and smell and inappropriate chewing movements are prominent features.
Anatomy of the ear. First, we're going to start with the external ear, which contains the pinna. The pinna is the projection from the head of the ear made out of elastic cartilage and is covered by thin skin and occasional hair. The next thing is the external auditory canal, which is lined with skin and hair and has sebaceous glands and apocrine sweat glands. And lastly, in the external ear, there's the tympanic membrane, which contains the eardrum and is made out of connective tissue. The tympanic membrane transfers sound energy to the tiny bones of the middle ear.
The middle ear is a small air-filled mucus-lined cavity. It has the oval window and a round window, which are the two openings. It also has the pharyngotympanic tube, which links the middle ear cavity to the nasopharynx. There's the auditory ossicles, which are the three bones in the ear, named the malleus, incus, and stapes, which transmit vibrations to the oval window. There's a homeostatic imbalance of the middle ear, which is called otitis media, which is the most common in kids and normally comes from a sore throat. It's the inflammation of the middle ear and is the most common cause of hearing loss in kids, which can also be treated with antibiotics.
Lastly, we're going to talk about the internal ear, which is also called the labyrinth site for delicate receptors. First is the bony labyrinth, which channels going through the bones. There's the vestibule, which is a cavity in bony labyrinth, and the cochlea, which is a bony chamber. There's also the semicircular canals, which rotates acceleration. Next is the membranous labyrinth, which is a membrane sac within the bony labyrinth. The membranous labyrinth contains the vestibular complex, which has two membranes, which divide into the saccule, which is a membrane that leads to cochlea, and the utricle, which is a membrane that leads to the semicircular ducts. The semicircular ducts works with utricle and also contains the anterior, posterior, and lateral ducts. Next is the ampulla, which houses equilibrium and contains crista ampullaris. Lastly is the cochlear duct, which is filled with endolymph inside the cochlea and houses the organ of Corti.
The ear continued. Sounds and mechanisms of hearing. Properties. There's two properties. The first property is frequency, which is the number of waves passing a given point in time. And the second property is amplitude, which is how loud they are. Sound transmission to inner ear is when the waves enter the external acoustic meatus and it vibrates the tympanic membrane and the pressure gets exerted to the oval window. Then the stapes rock back and forth against it and set the perilymph to a back and forth motion. Resonance of basilar membrane is when a particular frequency movement mechanically processes sound and signals before they can reach the receptors. Excitation of hair cells in organ corti has hairs that move with the basal membrane and then they close the ion channels and generate electric signals. In the auditory pathway, there's hair cells, the medulla, inferior cochleus, thalamus, and the auditory cortex and the temporal lobe. In the auditory pathway, it also transmits auditory info from cochlear receptors to the cerebral cortex. Auditory processing happens when there's a difference in sound wavelength and it's sufficient enough for discrimination and you hear two different tones. Pitch perception is when a sound has multiple frequencies and it activates several cochlear hair cells and cortical cells, so we perceive different tones. There's also detection of loudness, which is louder sounds creating larger movements. The localization of sound is when the brainstem nuclei helps us localize sound sources. There's two homeostatic imbalances, deafness and Meniere's syndrome. In deafness, there's also two types of it. Deafness is hearing loss, and the first type is conduction. Conduction deafness is when something hampers sound conductions to the fluids of the internal ear. It happens when there's a perforated or ruptured eardrum, which prevents sound conduction from the eardrums to the ossicles. Otitis media is the middle ear inflammation, which is the most common cause of the conduction deafness. Otosclerosis occurs when there's overgrowth of the bony tissue in the base of the stapes to the oval window. The second type of deafness is sensory neural deafness, which is damage to the neural structures at any point from the cochlear hair cells to the auditory cortical cells. There's tinnitus, which is ringing and buzzing or clicking sounds in the ear, which occurs when there's an absence of auditory stimuli. And the last one is Meniere's syndrome, which is a labyrinth disorder affecting the three parts of the internal ear. Next is the mechanisms of equilibrium and orientation. There's the vestibular apparatus, which has semicircular canals and the vestibule and receptors that send signals to the brain for reflexes. There's a static equilibrium, which is constant gravity, head position, and a linear acceleration. There's the maculae with the ultracle and saculae that monitor position of head space, controlling your posture. There's the autothallic membrane, which has otoliths that increase membrane's weight and an inertia, which resists changes in motion. The dynamic equilibrium has rotational movements. It has the crista ampullaris inside and the ampullae of semicircular canals. The crista is excited by head movement, and they respond to changes in velocity of your head movements. The hair cells and cupula are in the semicircular ducts, and they're opposite. They rotate directions and depolarize receptors in lamella and hyperpolarize in the other. The equilibrium pathway to the brain has hair cells and the vestibular branch of the vestibular cochlear nerve. The vestibular coculi and the brainstem reflex eye movements. The cerebellum does the fine-tuning of skeletal muscle.
Equilibrium disorders contain motion sickness, nausea, dizziness, loss of balance, and these are all common and may be in absence of rotational stimuli. Motion sickness is due to sensory input mismatches. Warning signals is due to excessive salivation, sweating, and deep rapid breathing. To get rid of it, you can take over-the-counter medicine and help alleviate symptoms.